Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Morrison, and I'm the Assistant Director and Adult Services Manager here at the Scarborough Public Library. Thank you for joining us tonight for our third and final Camden Conference presentation. We're going to start the evening with the library's land acknowledgement, read by Alan T. Paul, member of the Maliseet Nation and a library trustee.
The Scarborough Public Library acknowledges that it is located in the traditional homeland, past and present, of tribes in the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes who comprise the Confederacy: the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseets, and the Micmac, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge the Owaskoag people who once lived in what is now Scarborough. We respect the traditional values of these tribes and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences.
This is the 8th year the library has partnered with the Camden Conference to present a series of programs leading up to the conference to be held February 25th through 27th. We are grateful to the organization's continued financial support, which allows us to purchase materials related to each year's conference theme. A list of recommended books and films can be found on our Camden Conference page. The video recordings of our first two programs in this series, which were on Brexit and the memory wars of Central and Eastern Europe, have been posted on our Camden Conference page and on our YouTube channel. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, we'll hear from Lenore Rapkin, who will provide information on how you can take part in this year's conference. Lenore is a member of the library's Board of Trustees and part of the Camden Conference's Southern Maine Initiative Group.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another of the several programs that the Scarborough Public Library is pleased to present each year in connection with the Camden Conference. This program is part of a community outreach program sponsored by the conference, and the programs presented here at the library are tailored to deal with subjects relevant to the subject of the upcoming conference, which this year is Europe, Challenges at Home and Abroad. The dates of this year's conference are Friday, February 25th through the 27th. And although originally scheduled to be an in-person event, will be entirely online once again this year. Please check details at www.camdenconference.org. I don't want to keep you too long, as I'm sure you're anxious to hear tonight's speaker, but I did want to give you a little bit of background on the conference itself. Founded in 1987 as a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization focusing on international affairs, its mission is to foster informed discourse on world issues. It has presented an annual conference every February since 1988, and today draws upwards of 1,000 attendees each year. Speakers come from around the world to share their expertise and perspectives on the subject at hand. This evening's speaker will give you a taste of what one can expect at the conference. So please think of attending a future conference. You won't be disappointed. Now back to Catherine to introduce this evening's speaker. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Lenore. I'm eager to introduce our speaker for this evening. Tonight, our final Camden Conference speaker will discuss the Paris Agreement 6 years on and the state of environmental divides and climate unions in Europe. Dr. Susana Hancock is a multidisciplinary researcher engaged in Arctic climate geopolitics and environmental anthropology. Originally from Maine, she earned 2 master's degrees and her PhD in anthropology from Oxford University. Recently, she has been working on several reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, chairing a team with the UN's Ocean Decade, and is now embarking on a new project, the Jubilee Expedition, documenting the impacts of climate change in the North Atlantic and Arctic. She recently attended the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, speaking there and at the UN in Geneva. And we're very pleased to have her virtually with us at the library this evening. Turn it over to you, Susana.
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me this evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit, as was just said by Catherine, about Paris Accords and state of European climate politics. So, all right, start off with a short little clip, which is on global temperature change recently. So this will, it takes a second to get going. So let's just talk in a moment about sort of a 1.5 degree, 2 degree type thing in those concentric circles that are red mark that 1.5, 2 degrees. So I'll talk about that in a moment, but just getting that visual of temperatures warming, increasing as the years have been going on. So a brief outline of what I will talk about. Accelerating climate shifts, brief history of UN processes, Paris Accords, sort of getting everybody together on the same page again, a little bit in Glasgow, and Europe as a climate leader at the moment. So Europe isn't always a place that, at least on the continental side, we think about when we're talking about shifting climates. But I want to take a somewhat of a European-centric approach tonight and looking at some of these topics that are affecting the climate world over, and specifically in relation to international climate discussions and processes. So this slide here shows, well, on the that changing climate has been a key concern for Europeans overall. New data on the right is after COVID, that's 2020 data. So it's not totally new, but it is after the pandemic began, shows that climate change still tops the list of concerns for Europeans. There are several other countries added into this data on the right. Data on the left is 2018, focusing exclusively on Europe. The right adds in the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea as well. So, but it's otherwise, of those 14 countries, 9 of them are European. So we're still seeing the same trends that in Europe and around the world, climate change is sort of the leader of global concerns amongst people. What's also interesting is that the secondary concerns, spreads of infectious disease, i.e. COVID and others, terrorism, cyber attacks, nuclear weapons, poverty, economy, ethnic groups and conflicts, migrations, those are all secondary concerns related to climate. So that's not saying that if we fix climate, we'll fix all of these other issues, but that climate has a significant role in each of these additional tasks and issues. So, sort of setting the stage there. So what does this warming mean in practice? What does it look like in practice? I'm saying in Europe isn't a place where we're talking about necessarily sea level rise. Sure, you know, that we have increasing floods, we have heat spells in Europe that make the news in this part of the world, but in terms of what it actually looks like. So I'm going to share a picture of, this is a glacier that I worked on shortly after I was in high school, called Vatnajökull, and it's in Iceland. It's the largest glacier in in Europe. And so this is a picture of it quite a bit before I got there in 1999. And this is a picture of it in 2019. So you can just see the shrinking of the glacier there. This is another image of it. Again, this is from 1999, and this is 2019. So just watch sort of the depth is going down, the volume, cumulative volume is going down. So I was there approximately halfway through that process. So how have we been dealing with climate issues in Europe, but around the world? Big thing is through climate process policies and discussions. So again, that UN process. So I don't know how many of you remember the Kyoto Protocol, which technically didn't expire until 2020, but it sort of fell by the wayside quite a while ago. Partly because the US never ratified it, and it was really weighing on the US as the world's historic largest emitter of greenhouse gases to be on board. And since the US never joined, it really took a beating in terms of how it was perceived. So this graph here, a little bit of a scary graph, I find, but it's showing the temperature rise. So temperatures are, I'll show another image of this in a little bit. Temperatures are in colors. So each year is attributed to a color relative to its warmth. And on the left is the parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere. So the idea is that the more CO2 we have, it creates the sort of greenhouse effect that enables our temperatures to be rising. So higher the CO2, higher the temperatures. So what we're seeing in this image is that despite having climate conferences from really the 1980s onward, really picking up in 1992, temperatures are still rising. So the UN process of the COP process was initiated, the idea of it, at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and picked up in a couple years later, 1994, I believe, was the first one held in Germany. So we'll talk about Paris. Paris is really a turning point, and that came in 2015 were the meetings, and it was put into force in 2016. So what makes Paris special? I guess there are many, looking at Kyoto, and we had other protocols prior to Kyoto, but where those were falling short is that it was an international process, but designed from the top down. So it was people deciding what was going to happen, how people were going to act, and then telling people what to be doing. So it decided, for instance, which countries needed to meet which standards. It decided which countries were considered developed and which ones weren't. And if you were considered a developed country, you needed to reduce your emissions by X%. And if you weren't considered a developed country, then you were sort of off the hook for that. And so this created a lot of tension with, the US saying, well, China is currently growing in emissions and it's emitting a lot, but the UN says that China is still a developing country and therefore it doesn't need to reduce its emissions, whereas the US does. And one big weak point with this is that while it was legally binding, if the targets, there were no penalties for withdrawing, but there were fines if one failed to meet the targets. So with countries like the US never really ratifying it, and other countries like Canada realized that they were going to face millions of dollars in fines. So they withdrew when it became clear that they weren't going to meet their targets. And there was no issue with that. So this sort of system of top-down approach and people being told what to do and feeling that it wasn't weighed very evenly or equitably really contributed to Kyoto and previous agreements really falling flat and not making the impact they could make. So Paris was notable in that it really changed that approach. And by that, I mean, it was looking at how do we get everybody on board? If you're a developed country or a developing country, who is to say? And who is to say that if you're a developing country, you still don't have climate concerns that maybe you can address, maybe financially, maybe not financially, but they still need to be addressed. So Paris went from the bottom up. It said all countries are equal. And by that, it meant that each country has the right to vote or not, however it feels, that each country has the right to make its own decisions. And there's financial support for those countries that need financial support. So those that are experiencing extreme sea level rise, for example. And there was also a focus on adaptation and resilience and low carbon developments. How this worked, rather than having a fine system that Kyoto and other protocols had, was it basically worked on peer pressure. So I'm going to want, as a country, I'm going to want to make a contribution to reduce my emissions by X% because I don't want to be the one who's not doing it. And somebody else is going to do it because I'm doing it. And we're all going to kind of work together and pressure each other a little bit. So that was really how Paris operated. This idea, and I'll talk about its goals in a minute, but basically it operated through these NDC periods, which are nationally designated contributions. So those are the country itself deciding how much it feels it can reduce its emissions and where. So this went into force in 2018, and 2020 was the date where we would give new contributions, new pledges for contributions. The idea is that each time, every 5 years, new pledges come out, and each one is more stringent than the past. So we're sort of ratcheting up our emissions. So that's the idea. Halfway through these periods, we have global stock takes. The next one's coming out next year, so it's gonna be a little bit terrifying, but it's basically looking at all of these contributions. What does it actually mean? How is it actually affecting the planet? We'll take that data and then spit it back out and say, okay, here's the data. In 2 more years, you've got to make another contribution towards the gaps, really trying to ratchet that up and fill that in. So as of November, I'm not quite certain this map is accurate because Greenland is going to be privy to this, that they announced back in November. So I'm not entirely certain, but Greenland's also in a little bit of special status. So, but as of November 2021, 193 members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are parties to this agreement. Of the four UN Framework Convention climate change members not party of this, the major one is Iran, which emits about 2% of global emissions. So those are the ones that are yellow. On this map, the dark blue are just ones that are covered by the EU. So the EU is, as a body, is party to the agreement, as well as some of the individual countries. So the big goal that came out of Paris, and there's financial support and adaptation mitigation that I spoke about, but the big goal is temperature control. And the goal with that is we want to keep global warming to 2 degrees, ideally 1.5. And what that means is we're talking about 2 degrees centigrade, so that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels. So we're talking about mid-1800s. So our global temperatures in mid-1800s, we want to keep them no more than 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 above that. So that's the scale that we're talking about. So that's 2.7 to 3.6 degrees warmer than mid-1800s. Here in Maine, in the mid-coast, southern coast region, or mid-Atlantic region, we've already exceeded that temperature, and we're going to be, certainly going to be, we're warming probably 3 times more quickly here than we are in other parts of the world. And as you can see on this map here, when we're talking about changes at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, it's important to note that this 2 degrees isn't a sort of a flat 2 degrees around the world. So like this part of the world that's warming a bit warmer than other parts of this country, for example, you can see on these maps that the polar regions, especially the Arctic, is warming significantly faster. It's warming about 4 times faster than the rest of the world. So when we talk about 2 degrees, in some parts of that world, it's going to be a lot less than 2 degrees. And you know, the world is cooling. In other parts, it's going to be significantly higher than 2 degrees. So that's sort of an average. So when you're thinking about the impacts of it, it's important to know that, you know, it's not just that it's going to be 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer and, you know, might not feel like a big difference. It's that you're averaging the middle of the Pacific with the middle of, you know, a continental spot. So
Susanna, we have a
Yes.
question from someone who says, I thought that the financial incentives brought up in Paris have not been implemented yet. Can you clarify that?
yes, so I'll talk about that in a moment. So when we were in Glasgow, there was a sort of a re-up of that. So I think Paris sort of set the Paris Accord set the framework, but it didn't fully, it hasn't fully, all of the articles of it have not been fully enforced yet. So,
Okay. Thank you.
yeah. So I don't know if that answers Sue's question. Hello, Sue, nice to see you. But we'll hopefully talk about that a little bit more. So this is sort of another view on that equality of temperatures warming in different regions and different places and different goals of different countries. This is just a map. It doesn't cover all countries, obviously. It's just a map of countries marked by the Climate Action Tracker, which tracks certain countries about what they're doing, what their pledges are, how those pledges tie into this 1.5 or 2 degree temperature. And basically showing that the pledges that are out there are basically insufficient. You know, we have Russia there coming in and critically insufficient. The US is now just down to the insufficient. It was also in the critically insufficient in the past couple of years, but a lot of talk, not so much on the action. So another view of this is this graph that I like, that just shows sort of the incline of our historical emissions and then our options. It's sort of a choose your own adventure. What do we want a future to be? You know, in this pre-Paris era, our emissions were continuing status quo to go up. If we want to get to that 1.5 degrees, we need to drop emissions pretty much immediately, knowing that the emissions that we are polluting today are locking in higher temperatures for the next several decades. So, you know, just because we stop all emissions now, the temperature in the world is still going to increase overall for the next little while. So the yellow line there is sort of where we're pledged. So that's still above that. There's a 2 degree mark, that sort of line on the bottom. Current policies, again, we're overshooting also what we've pledged. So this brings me to Glasgow. The last UN climate summit was held last November in Glasgow, which is where really the most outstanding article of the Paris agreements was to be debated. And this is largely concerning the structure of carbon markets. And Glasgow's goal objectively was to confirm our pathway on that 1.5 degrees. Worth noting that of that 1.5 degrees, saying that that's that temperature above mid 1800s, we're already about 1.2, little over 1.2 degrees, having used up that amount of temperature. So, you know, we're not talking about 1.5 degrees above where we are now. We're talking about, you know, a quarter of a degree above where we are now. So, you know, to be able to just, you know, our time frame to shrink for that last degree is quite small. So Glasgow is really wanting to confirm that. I had a lot of hope from around the world going into it. I personally don't think I had many expectations, and I think that it lived up to my expectations. So a little bit frustrating, but what was really cool, I think a highlight from you there is the number of people. I was looking at a graph today saying that the first COP conference in Bonn had just under 1,400 people there. And that was not the lowest attended conference. And these are ones that are open to delegates from around the world. All countries who are part of the Framework Convention on Climate Change are invited. This conference had about 40,000 people. And so that represents the official delegates, but it also represents people who are actively showing up, participating either in sort of panel events on the side or whatever. But a lot of people came to protest and to say that whatever the heck they're talking about isn't affecting change as we need it. So there was one walk November 6th, which is the Global Day of Action. It was November 6th or 5th. And about 100,000 people showed up to protest in the streets. And there were simultaneous protests that were going on in Glasgow City with the city management there, and protests joined protests and people got together. And it was really neat. And it was fun to see people who had maybe not really much interest in climate action feeling that they could be a part of this. And by that, I mean people who live in Glasgow, people who are working there, who like, oh, there's a protest and I've learned about this and I feel that it's important, so I'm going to close my shop for the day and go out in the streets. And so it was just, that sort of human energy was really exciting and something that I hadn't really seen at other events before that felt much more formal. And formal as in not really a space for everybody to come together. And just of note, in the middle of this picture, there's that banner with the net zero. And just since that's a thing that we're talking about quite a bit, maybe a familiar term, net zero is a question, sort of a contentious issue in the climate world, because it's the idea that we can pollute a certain amount and we'll take out a certain amount from the atmosphere, and hopefully that balances out. The problem is, as I'll say in a moment, we're really relying on technology that we don't have. And in many cases, depending on who's using this term, it can be used as a way of, let's continue the status quo and we will deal with the extraction later. And when those technologies don't balance out, that creates longer term issues, and we're sort of just putting off a problem and making it worse in the long run. So that's just what that's about, since maybe something. Posters, there are always a lot of posters and displays, and creativity is fun. And so these are a couple from Scotland that I liked that were particularly Glaswegian in some way. So just to give another visual, probably should have shown this earlier, but just looking at, again, those stripes that I had mentioned earlier, this is each year since the series was done by a guy, Ed Hawkins, at the University of Reading in England, and each year is given a color. But this basically shows that at our current pledges, that 3-degree world, you can see on the top how much darker those reds are going to become. And then at the bottom, if we were to make, by 1950, if we were to be net zero, or 2050 and be net zero, and we capped our emissions so that our temperature average doesn't increase more than 1.5, you can see that we're still getting progressively darker colors, but not to the same degree. So again, it's making those actions now that we want for a world in a couple decades. One of my favorite moments there was a speech that was actually not given there, but by Simon Kofa, who's the Minister for Justice, Communication and Foreign Affairs in Tuvalu, which is the island country in the Polynesian subregion of the Pacific Ocean. And COVID blocked many people from travel. So there were a lot of speeches online, but one of my favorites was from this person. And he spoke about the fact that who's making these decisions and who's being impacted by these decisions, and climate doesn't affect us all equally. So he gave it, waist deep in water behind his lectern, noting that this is the fate of his country, and those making decisions are still talking about a net zero world in which we can continue to pollute with the hopes of future sort of technology that's going to save us. So this is just one moment that I liked from Glasgow. So talk a little bit about the European side, just to keep this focused a bit on Europe. But so in addition to affirming the Paris Pledge, the EU was there also as a body to support a lot of other actions. This conference was in Europe. It often is in Europe. It's supposed to move around the world, but it often defaults to Europe, in part because the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change is based in Germany, in Bonn. So at the meeting in November, the EU as a body held 150 side events in Glasgow and in Brussels, which had about 20,000 people joining, both in person and online. Two of the key agreements that came out of the Glasgow conference were sponsored by the EU. One was done in conjunction with the United States, which was the Global Methane Pledge. And this is sort of one of those half-baked projects, in my opinion. It's great that it's the first time we've ever actually had a pledge that tackles a greenhouse gas that's not carbon dioxide. So in that sense, it's really exciting. On the other side, it's, you know, it falls short in that it probably gets what's been pledged, maybe 40% of what we need to reduce methane to have a meaningful impact towards that 1.5 degrees. Methane is a gas that is about 80 times more pollutant than, or more potent than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, although it breaks down much faster, breaks down into CO2. So it's, yeah, so it's one that we really need to be tackling. Another goal was to step up climate finance, and this talks maybe goes to Sue's question a little bit. Climate finance has been a goal since the Copenhagen Accord, which was 2009. And there was very poor follow through. So this time it was reinvigorated with steeper goals. And this finance basically is to provide money from those countries that can afford it to those countries that really need it for their climate processes. There's always been a bit of debate as to whether this money should go towards mitigation or adaptation. So mitigation is sort of that preventing something from happening, and adaptation is, okay, that thing has happened, how do we deal with it? So for example, you know, do we try to prevent the sea level from rising, or do we say, well, the sea level is rising, let's build levees, for example? So that's a difference between mitigation and adaptation. And so ultimately, adaptation in these discussions in Glasgow, adaptation won out. So the finances is 3-to-1 for adaptation work versus mitigation work, but that's largely for vulnerable countries and small island states to support them through at least 2025. So 5 years of funding. The EU is the largest contributor. It provides approximately about 1/3 of the annual fund. And President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced an additional 4 billion euros that the EU would be pledging, bringing its total to just under about 28 billion euros, assuming follow through. So I should say that it was $100 billion in US dollars. So that 28 billion euros does total to that approximate 1/3. So Europe's interest in leading on the climate world is severalfold. One is that the EU is a place that has had an emissions trading scheme that it launched in 2005 to reduce emissions, and it's become a big part of the EU energy policy. Emissions trading in Europe now covers more than 11,000 factories, power stations, and other installations that have a net heat excess of 20 megawatts. It covers 31 countries, so it's all 27 EU states. Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland, and the United Kingdom are all part of this system in some capacity. It's been a bit of a learning curve, and so there's also that sort of that knowledge that we want to share, because there are certainly other countries, the US being one of them, that is talking about how do we have some kind of climate market, carbon market. And it's mentioned with that Article 6 that Glasgow is set to address. there is within the Paris agreements that aspect of carbon markets as well. So this recent phase of the European emissions trading scheme started last January, and it will go through the end of the decade. And it's a bit hazy. In Glasgow, they were supposed to establish what they would target for the reduction, how much they would hope to reduce the emissions, and thought that maybe 43%, but it's now set for 61% based on 2005 levels when this project started. So not entirely certain. How this works is, as you can see with the little graph here, there are a certain number of allowances, permits that are used, they're auctioned off. Each one, for example, is valued at a ton of carbon dioxide. If I'm a polluting power station, I use them, I need carbon dioxide, I need to pollute X amount to do whatever I'm going to be doing, I can purchase these permits. And that enables me, if I acquire 10 permits, I can produce 10 tons of emissions, for example. The idea is that each year there are fewer permits available. So the value in those permits increases, which at some point I'm going to decide it's actually cheaper and worth it for me to invest in energy elsewhere, so it's not polluting. So that by having that reduced, a fewer number of available permits, it's ideally going to spur innovation. And you can do different things with the funding that you get from these. So last Friday, a ton of carbon dioxide in Europe was 97 euros and 50 cents. So that's how much it costs to pollute 1 ton. That's because it's a market system, the numbers fluctuates quite a lot. So that's 200% more than it was a year ago at this time, and certainly up from a low of 10 cents per ton in 2007. So I can imagine that if it cost me 10 cents per ton to pollute a ton, I'm going to probably pollute a lot more tons than if it cost me nearly 100 euros, or at least that might start calculating into my equations. So system isn't perfect. It's vulnerable to cyber attacks. There's sort of permitted offsets, and it so far hasn't really been significant enough to spur innovation, although it is increasing. Another thing with Europe is that it doesn't really have an energy source itself in terms of petroleum. So just as a visual of this shows the pipelines coming into Europe. Green ones are the existing pipelines, and the red and orange around the waters, especially in the Mediterranean, are shipping routes for liquid natural gas. But the point here is looking at this map and seeing Europe in the center, the lighter colors. This map shows sort of natural fuel reserves or oil reserves in the country. So where there's oil in the ground effectively. So you can see a lot in Russia, for example. The US has a fair amount. So Europe has seen surging fuel prices, as have we, if anybody's been to the gas pump recently. But it's also seen a decreased supply in natural gas as well. And this has especially been concerning in the winter now and last fall as we were heading into winter. Several reasons for this. Russia, we go back to this map, we can see some of these. We've got Russia coming in, we've got some in the Middle East, we've got some coming in from Africa. I mean, so Russia has been historically a producer for the US, for Europe, and it has chosen to prioritize its domestic fuel needs largely. So Europe has not been getting the same sources from Russia as it had traditionally. Spain was getting a lot directly from Algeria, and Algeria again stopped supplying to Spain. The US had been another big source, and it's found that it gets more money for distributing to Asia than it does to Europe. So it's gone that route. So this has meant that Europe has not had the same petroleum-based resources that it has had in the past. At the same time, it's been attempting to generate electricity through solar and wind, et cetera, but it hasn't yet really gotten that up and going at a sustainable degree, which is why it's been having its part about the fuel crisis there, et cetera. So there are questions now about, are we reopening the fuel markets and have, pay more for imported fossil fuels that we're going to try to divert from somewhere else. Gotten into a couple nasty arguments about this, especially with one Russian leader when I was at the UN back in November. So kind of a hot topic, kind of interesting. But part of this is this really overshadows the whole Green New Deal, EU Green Deal, which was implemented about 2 years ago, December 2019, which aims to make Europe the first carbon neutral continent in the world. European Commission really cited this as Europe's sort of man on the moon moment, and getting into that, again, that sort of carbon neutral and what does it mean to be carbon neutral? Going back to that same idea of what does it mean to be net zero? Carbon neutral is, yes, okay, if we need fuel for heating, how are we going to offset that? So just for perspective, since if anybody's been on a plane recently and you can purchase you can purchase your tickets and then you can purchase your offsets for your fuel, and that's a whole messy topic. But last year, the world's largest plant that takes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it into the ground opened in Iceland, and it can take 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. So what is 4,000 tons? It's the equivalent of about 790 cars. So that's not that many cars if you think of, think of how many cars there are on your street. I mean, 790 around the world is not that many, but that's 4,000 tons. Last year, the world emitted 31 billion tons. So, if we're having 31 billion tons that we're emitting and we're able to, at best, extract 4,000 of those, you can hopefully see why the net zero isn't quite working out with the current technology, and that we're going to just keep polluting a lot more than we're able to take out. But that's Europe's on that mission now, and really leading that through its existing policies. But as part of the Green Deal, not only do you have the emission, are you building on the emissions trading schemes, you aiming to reduce the greenhouse gases. It's reviewing its laws, looking at circular economies, building renovations, and biodiversity, farming, innovations, etc. But Europe is also operating as a continent, and like the US, it's got a bunch of different players within it who all have their own leadership as well. And this basically means that not all European countries are on board. Inevitably, COVID has thrown in its fair share of loops, which have been integrated to some degree in terms of policy. Poland, for example, is citing an expected need that it's going to continue to use coal. It doesn't see that it can get away from coal in the near future. Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Romania have all said that those countries that are benefiting from any kind of EU supported funding for this green transition are those that probably had the resources to at least initiate that process themselves, and that more financial support is needed by sort of the Southern and Eastern European countries, and that it's not disseminated fairly and equitably. Other criticisms, the Romanian president says that Romania is prepared, as maybe some others, to follow Britain's exit from the EU. So you had the recent talk about Brexit. Are other countries prepared to follow suit and to say that we can't afford to be part of the EU anymore and leave? I'm not sure that that's really likely, but there are talks. There are several of the countries that are threatening to do this. ExxonMobil, so one of the world's biggest oil companies, was also involved in some of these early negotiations of the Green Deal, which was influencing where petroleum reductions would be made, so that ExxonMobil stood not to lose as much as some of the other companies. So that was a bit of one of those questions of, how can you take something seriously when they're not necessarily disclosing all of their players? And largely, the biggest criticism that I certainly agree with is, it's a little too late, a little too little and a little too late, and opens loopholes for countries that are not really willing to join, and makes it not really problematic for them. So, I think, the question of Glasgow, was it a failure, was it not? And at the moment, I would say it is, but there was this idea of let's come back next year with something bigger. And I guess if everybody comes back next year with something bigger and something stronger, then I can take back my statements. But there is a lot of urgency on Europe's part. It stands to suffer, fuel loss without a transition on energy sources. So I don't just mean fuel loss in terms of petroleum, but if it's not able to produce its own energy without the development of alternative energy sources, then it does struggle there. It's dealing with consequences. So the migration crisis in Europe, especially peaking in 2015, that had more people coming into Europe than any time since World War II. The heat waves, changes and losses of growing seasons, some of those being longer, some shorter, different things that are able to be grown, disastrous floods. But it also has a lot of opportunity. It has a lot of the wealthier nations where they can afford to make some of these transitions. They can afford to use other sources of energy. And it has, coming from a background of, strong policy and tried policy. So it is in that position. So I think I will end there, 7:25, and open the floor to any questions or discussion or whatever you'd like. So thank you.
So can you talk a little bit about the alternative fuels that Europe is exploring? I know I heard on the radio recently how Germany and France are in disagreement. One is trying to expand nuclear power, and one is trying to shut down all their plants.
Yeah, there's kind of interesting discussions about that, because there's also different interpretations. So yes, like nuclear, with different countries feeling that it should be considered a renewable source, and other countries saying, what do you do with the waste for it, and are we creating more problems than we're fixing? What do you do with a nuclear disaster? What do you do with But hydro energy, for example, some countries consider that a renewable resource and some countries don't. Because you're balancing water, which is technically renewable in many ways, but you're also the impact to the environment. What are you doing? How are you doing it? One example that I've been looking into a bit recently is on deep sea mining. And deep sea mining is mining for minerals that we're saying we need: cobalt, manganese, copper, zinc, gold, that we need for cell phones, for batteries, for things. Cell phones, bad example, but for our, for electric vehicles, for example. Where are we getting those minerals? They're coming from the earth somewhere. And mining has been disastrous both for the environment and human rights aspects, especially how we tend to do it, where we have a bit of a NIMBYism, and those in the control are choosing where they're going and not always paying attention to how it's impacting people who live there, and getting to questions on human slavery and all sorts of things. So deep sea mining is mining in the ocean, on the ocean floor. It gets rid of a lot of those human rights issues that people are getting, that are being sticking points, but it also creates other issues. Notably, we don't know the impact to the environment, except we know that it's causing a lot of, changes the pH, and you're basically just plowing through the ocean, basically with a vacuum cleaner, and sucking up all sorts of things. And Samsung, BMW, et cetera, have come out and said that we don't want any of our materials associated with deep sea mining because we're not comfortable with that technology. We think it's causing a lot of harm. The EU has come in to say, you know, we don't support that. But Norway, which is not part of the EU, has said, actually, this is 30% more environmentally friendly than the mining that we do on land. So for Norway, you have this situation where you have these two entities, both having a position that's in opposition on deep sea mining, but both the end goal of reducing their emissions. So I think, things like that I think are quite interesting, where you get these little sort of headbutting
Right.
cases. And so whether that's, it's what works for some places isn't working for others. But yeah, Germany's made some great gains recently in the alternative fuels. Denmark, Amsterdam have done a lot with offshore winds. Norway's done a lot with hydropower, again, which they consider renewable. Norway's an interesting question because they are an oil country. I think they're the 7th largest exporter of oil, but they argue that they're going to be, or shortly, carbon neutral, that their oil that they export doesn't actually count towards their own emissions. And how you calculate stuff, you get numbers to say whatever you want them to say, but they're very different in how they export fuel. The oil isn't actually the same oil that they use themselves. So they do a lot with solar is a big one. And you go into northern Scandinavia where the sun only shines for half the year, but they have solar panels on the sides of buildings because you'll get that low sunlight. So yeah.
You did mention, I think, one country where they're like here, where depending on the administration, we were in and then we were out. Now we're back in again. Is there that in any of the other European countries, or?
Yeah, I mean, you have the different priorities.
Debates.
I mean, the UK held the Glasgow summit along with Italy. Italy was part of the leadership for it, but the UK held it, and then they're talking about opening a new coal mine, and how you can have Boris Johnson speaking about how the UK is leading climate actions, and then on the eve of the summit, his foreign minister was in the Gulf states negotiating a post-Brexit oil trade, and it's like you're sitting here talking about stuff. I mean, Biden left the summit after to go and finalize some oil leases in the Gulf of Mexico after saying that the U.S. is going to be a global leader on this. Mm-hmm. So it comes down to a balance of priorities too, but who is in office and what are their priorities, and what is the whole administration. So yeah, not all countries, said within Europe, not all countries are involved or part of it, and having the EU as its own block, it acts as a block so that it can make decisions that encompass those of its member states, even without the member states agreeing. So.
Well, I think your presentation was so thorough that we don't seem to have anyone asking questions. But I'm gonna give people one more chance to ask any questions they have about this very complex topic.
Questions. How do European countries view the US's involvement in climate negotiations and action plan? Excellent, thank you, Courtney. So I mean, the US is very much has been held as, the country that's historically most responsible, the country that has a lot of the repairing to do, which is a view that the US hasn't really wanted to take. And it says, okay, we're historically responsible, but everybody can learn from our mistakes. So just because we polluted X amount doesn't mean that everybody else would if they jump on the bandwagon with our updated knowledge. And so that's sort of been the approach that the US has taken. But it also means that when the US isn't there, because it's been the historical biggest emitter. When the US isn't at the table, that's been significant. It's like, well, if the US doesn't care to do this, why should we do it? And the US has been cited in some sources as the reason that the Kyoto Protocol and previous agreements never got off the table, or never really had that impact, because the US wasn't there. So I think having the US back at the table it was really welcomed back into Paris, and lots of celebrations about that. So I think that was great. And the US is, but it's, as Biden said when he was there, gotta not just be back, but actually take the role that the US can take. We have the resources, we have the financial ability to do it. We are in a great position to lead, but we need to do that. And so again, where are the leverage points for change? Seems to me there's a better chance of making change in the courts, not in political negotiations. Your thoughts? Yeah, absolutely. And certainly we've seen in certain courts around the world, the Netherlands, for example, that said that everybody has the right to have a healthy environment. In Maine, we are working on the Pine Tree Amendment, which is a citizens initiative, I think, so you'll correct me if I'm wrong though, to have everybody have that healthy environment and the right to a clean world. And so, both at the national and subnational, but international level is sort of getting there. The courts are getting involved, and I think that's a significant part. I think one of the problems with the political negotiations is that we haven't had a better system come up. Everybody recognizes the faults with it, but there hasn't been something that's been able to really supplant that yet. So where the courts go, I don't know, but I would like to think that they're going to be having a bigger role, because I think it's inevitable that they are going to, if we don't get some other things solved outside of that.
Okay. So I don't see any further questions. So I'm going to thank you very much for giving us all that information. Extremely challenging problem that the biggest problem I think we have right now in the world. So we're hoping, can you tell us maybe a little bit about your expedition that you're going to be working on before you?
Yeah, so I am heading up. I'm going up for a training expedition in a couple of weeks, but I'll be leaving end of April to head up to Svalbard. So it's a archipelago north of Norway, and going to be going out on skis. About 600 kilometers is the goal. We're not really sure how far we're going to go because of the sea ice conditions. And we'll be taking some climate measurements. We are retracing an expedition from 150 years ago, and nobody's been there since. And we don't think anybody's gonna be able to be there after us. So it's kind of exciting. By us, there's 7 of us right now, 3 scientists, 2 guides, and 2 photographers. So we're gonna be putting out an exhibition, a film that hopefully will be released. So keep your eyes open for that, and a book or 2 about it. But this expedition from 150 years ago had a lot of climate measurements that were just taken out of curiosity, really. And so we have all that data. It's all in Swedish, so that's luckily most people there speak Swedish, and I'm learning. Okay. But we have all this data, so we can really look at how this part of the world that is warming at least 4 times faster than the rest of the world, what has changed in 150 years. And we all have our own research projects that we are going to be doing while we're there as well, and getting connected with international organizations, universities, NASA, et cetera, with some research that they want done, because we're going to be in a part of the Arctic that said people haven't been. And so there's parts where people go that are fairly accessible. And so you can get data. There's a lot of data for that, but there isn't anything for where we are. So kind of excited for that. So
Well, we wish you the best of luck with
Well,
that
thank
and
you.
safe travels. And we hope when the
Thank
film
you.
is done that you'll come back and
Yeah.
maybe we can do a showing here or something. So
Excellent.
thank you,
Thank you,
Susanna,
Catherine.
and thank you everyone who tuned in tonight. Stay tuned for future programs. We do have programs coming up on the climate, including on February 24th, the Citizens Climate League will be doing a presentation. So check out our website, www.scarboroughlibrary.org, for information on that program. So thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.